Over the years, the Dodge Viper has become a veritable legend in the automotive world. Mario Andretti once told me personally that the early Viper was the scariest car he ever drove on a racetrack because the rear end gave no warning when it was going to let go and get into a slide and provided no way to recover from it once initiated. Its V10 engine was a first among American sports cars, and in the early 1990s, the Viper was developing a reputation as America's first supercar. But believe it or not, it almost didn't happen. That story right after the break. Did you know that the average driver gets 9 traffic tickets in their lifetime? Look, I'll be the first to admit that I've taken maybe a couple of liberties with traffic laws back in the day. And of course, when I got caught, I had to go to court to fight the ticket, which was always a hassle. And each time that I lost my case, it meant big fines, points on my record, and higher insurance premiums. Eventually, I realized that nothing beats having a good attorney argue your case in court. So here's what you do. You download the Off the Record app to your phone and register for an account. And if you get a ticket, simply upload a photo of your ticket into the app and you will be quickly matched with a lawyer in your jurisdiction. Your lawyer will start working your case right away, and in most cases, you'll never have to set foot in a courtroom. Off the Record has a 97% success rate and a 4.9 star rating on Google. And guess what? They even offer a money-back guarantee if they aren't able to reduce the points or keep that ticket fully off your record. Best of all, I've arranged a 10% discount for all of my YouTube viewers, so download the app and register using the referral code FASTLIFE to receive 10% off your first case. Bear with me as I go through the backstory because it'll set everything up. Back in 1991, I took a job with a company called NGK Spark Plugs, who was based at that time here in Southern California. When I first started, I was working in territory servicing NGK's wholesalers and chain stores. But as is the case with most Japanese companies, employees in a Japanese company are expected to work in several positions to learn the business. After a short while, I was sent to Japan to learn about oxygen sensors for my next role. As NGK's parent company is NTK, Nippon Technical Ceramics, and all of their businesses revolve around ceramics, and oxygen sensors were part of that. In fact, they also own a company called Mikasa, a company known for its fine ceramic dinnerware, so the whole company was built around ceramics. Oxygen sensors have a ceramic center section too, coated with things like titanium dioxide as an example. And after extensive training in Japan, I returned to the United States office where I was assigned to the U.S. Oxygen Sensor Division, which was just getting up and running. By this time, it was the year 1995, and we were busy field testing our oxygen sensors for the new Bucks and OBD2 Dodge Vipers. As I recall, the designation Bucks meant built for export, and one of the changes was that the side exit exhaust would be channeled to the back of the car with this change. And if you remember, back then they all had side pipes. In the United States, the implementation of OBD2 meant that these cars had to have 4 catalytic converters as opposed to 2. And as such, the O2 sensors were very important to this equation. A fun fact, the side exhaust of the previous Vipers had to be ditched for a full-length exhaust because of how the O2 sensors worked and the heat considerations. By this time in my career, I spoke enough Japanese to communicate with the Japanese engineers, and I was assigned to serve as a liaison between our Japanese engineers here in the United States and in Japan, and Chrysler and SRT procurement engineering staff. If you ever saw a movie called Gung Ho, it was back in the 1980s with Michael Keaton, I was basically the guy that he was playing in that movie. So. During this time, I got to be pretty good friends with one of the Chrysler engineers because he knew I was a muscle car guy, and we had that in common, and so we got to be kind of fast friends. At that time, which was early 1995, this fellow had already been with Chrysler for more than 25 years, and boy did he have stories to tell. In fact, he was at Chrysler during the turbulent years of the 1970s and personally experienced the pains at Chrysler as the United States started to move away from leaded gasoline to unleaded gasoline, which is a whole nother story. We'll get into that another time. He was also there during the move away from V8s and the move into 4-cylinder engines, a move prompted in the 1970s at a time when gas prices doubled in 1 year. It was about 50 cents and went up to $1. That was a lot of money back then. He also witnessed the death of the rear-wheel drive cars with the big engines and the dawn of 4-cylinder engines and front-wheel drive right here in the United States. he would just share snippets with me, like how Chrysler minivan transmissions were utter garbage, and how all these changes and new regulatory considerations really hurt on all American car companies. And by 1979, Chrysler was on the verge of bankruptcy. For people who were in the car business back in that time, it's no secret that the 1970s was perhaps the worst decade for cars up to that point. And if you were around at that time, you saw the changes happening right before your eyes, and they were not good things. During this time, the United States went through, 3 different recessions, 2 energy crises, including an oil embargo to the U.S. by OPEC, which led to gas lines. It was so bad, actually, that you were only allowed to get gas every other day, odd number of license plates on one day, even a number of license plate on another day. And you could only get a certain amount of gallons, 5 gallons or whatever it was. Car makers were also suffering from the new environmental regulations and the adoption of fuel mileage standards, the EPA regulations and that kind of thing in corporate average fuel economy. Chrysler back then was still building 5,000-pound cars that were 19 feet long and struggled to get 12 miles per gallon on a good day. I know my mom had one of them. By 1979, Chrysler found itself unable to compete with the new Japanese subcompact cars and other imports, and especially German mid-luxury cars. It was really, really bad time for them. Lee Iacocca was serving as president or chairman of Chrysler at the time. Iacocca, everybody knows who this guy is. He was the man who brought the world the Ford Mustang back in 1964. So he was brought on board to deal with the perfect storm, what seemed to be a perfect storm of adverse conditions, including high interest rates at the time, which made it harder to finance a car, which was further affecting sales, and falling sales of Chrysler's gas-guzzling cars as the rest of the world moved to more fuel-efficient cars. Iacocca knew Chrysler was about to collapse, so he approached the federal government for a bailout, which was pretty ballsy back then. He asked for a bailout of $1.5 billion, which would come to about $6 billion today, something like that. The government didn't actually loan out any money, but they guaranteed the loans of those institutions who played ball. And as my friend and I were talking about these things, he suddenly got quiet and he just kind of pulled me aside. It was really weird. And he started talking very quietly, but everything else before that he would say very, very loudly and not privately. Basically, he told me that Chrysler got the bailout it needed, but it came with many strings attached. So you can imagine this discussion, so I'm listening intently. For starters, Chrysler had to get $2 billion in concessions from the United Auto Workers unions, their suppliers, their internal management team, as well as their own white-collar employees, and from the car dealers, all the car dealers in the network. Also buried in the terms and conditions was the stipulation that, and this is a good one, that Chrysler needed to stop producing big passenger cars with big V8 engines. I was like, what? There were still V8s in the Chrysler Imperial up to about 1984. My mom had one and she was driving around. So I was kind of saying, I don't think that's right. Basically, he said this, that was the last of the run of those engines in passenger cars, he said, and the deal only applied to new passenger vehicle designs that were coming up. Chrysler apparently already knew that they needed to pivot in order to adapt to the new reality of high gas prices and new regulations about standards, about emissions, and fuel mileage. By 1978, Chrysler had already partnered with companies like Mitsubishi to produce a car called the Dodge Colt and the Plymouth Champ. Both were little tiny cars with wheezy 1.6 liter four bangers. If you could Google them and see what they look like, they just look like a standard hatchback. Chrysler had seen the handwriting on the wall and they were already moving to small cars. But to do so, they had to partner with Japanese companies who were way ahead of them. And so what they did was rebadge some of the Japanese manufacturers' cars. Those relationships included companies like Mitsubishi and Renault. This is why you saw a Dodge 420A engine in a Mitsubishi Eclipse and Renault engines and very other AMC Eagle products. With the bailout cash now in their pocket, Chrysler moved on to developing more fuel-efficient cars in-house themselves. And the big one was the Chrysler K cars, and that's how they were born. And in 1984, Chrysler hit pay dirt when they released something called a minivan. Be patient, I'm almost there to the story. SUVs did not exist back then, so for those with families, the only way to pack the family and their gear into a vehicle is to create a big box, which was the most efficient use of space, and just put an engine at one end of the vehicle or the other. So that was a minivan. They used the Chrysler K platform as the basis for the minivan to save money, and it was a gigantic hit. They sold 209,000 of them in the first year and sold about 600,000 every year thereafter. Now, riding high on the success, Chrysler could move forward with a project that was originally discussed by Tom Gale, Chrysler's chief of design, and Robert Lutz back in 1988. Okay, we're in the early 90s at this point. The timing wasn't right at that time, but perhaps now they could move forward. Lutz wanted to do something like a modern take on the Shelby Cobra or even the Jaguar E-Type, or a combination of both. Now, I knew much of this history already because I lived through it, but what my friend told me next is something I've never ever heard. I've never read it in any report. Mainstream automotive media never reported this. So the way he says it goes like this: we had no problem coming up with the chassis, so the problem was finding an engine that could live up to the Viper's looks, and we didn't really have anything in the inventory at that time. He went on to say that the discussion went around the table as to what engine this car would use, and a lot of people were sitting at that table having a discussion. He says someone, and I will call him manager number one because I don't want to use a real name, suggested using one of Chrysler's 5.9 liter Magnum V8 engines, which back then were relegated to pickup trucks. If you've ever owned one, you know that engine. Another person chimed in and said, well, but we're not allowed to use V8s in passenger cars. And then everybody looked around and said, yeah, that's right. Manager number one said, did they say anything about V10s?
Run.
And as the story goes, everyone looked at each other like, no. They never said anything about it. Slowly, their concerned looks changed into smiles. They all realized that there was now no restriction preventing them from using a V10 engine. The only problem was they didn't have one. But the concept of the V10 was born right then and there. The rest is history. Using the Magnum 5.9 liter V8 as the basis of the V10, Lamborghini basically recast the block and heads in aluminum. You have to remember Lamborghini old Chrysler at that time. When they were done, it was 2 liters bigger than the original Chrysler 5.9 engine, and it was built at a quarter of the price of the 5.9 liter Magnum. And that's it. That's how the Viper ended up with a V10 rather than a V8. Now, I know people are going to be skeptical about this, and I'm a little skeptical myself. To this day, I've never seen this printed or reported in the mainstream automotive press. Nowhere, and I scoured everything. So was it a tall tale from a soon-to-be retired Chrysler engineer, or was he sharing a gold nugget because we bonded? We got to be buddies? I'd love to give him credit for this information, but it's been years since I've talked to him, and I wouldn't want to get him into any trouble because he might still be working for those guys, but who knows. Personally, I believe his story, especially after working with him for almost 2 years. He just wasn't a guy that was like a BSer, you know? But you can decide for yourself. If it's true, it's a fascinating story, and I was privileged to hear it. If it's not true, it's a tall tale. Wouldn't be the first I've heard in the business. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with your friends, and we'll see you next time.